Hello, my name is Tyler, and this is definitely going to be the most complicated video I've ever made yet, which is why I want to shoot an introduction or a disclaimer or whatever this is right before I start to address a few things before I really get into the meat of what I'm talking about with this video. The first thing I want to talk about is before you guys either comment that I'm wrong in some capacity, which I very well could be, or dislike the video, I just want you guys to watch until the end. I really am trying with this video to not to attack an author, not to really attack a person, but really just take a look at all the evidence we have through books, through interviews, through really everything, and try to just place evidence in front of you guys. Clearly, if you're watching this, you're interested in the title itself, which is Haruki Murakami a sexist author? And the purpose of that title is for me not to make a claim by saying Haruki Murakami is a sexist author, or Haruki Murakami is not a sexist author, but really just to try to present evidence and create a discussion and create really an engagement around this topic, because I've seen a lot of comments and criticisms online about this specific criticism of Haruki Murakami's treatment of female characters. I just want to clarify a few things. Haruki Murakami is one of, if not my favorite author ever. I have read all of his books multiple times. I love the way he creates worlds, his prose, his characters, really everything. But that doesn't mean he's impervious to criticisms. I actually don't think any of his books are perfect. This allows me to have this nice and interesting perspective where I'm able to take a step back because I don't love all of his books and really look at him from an unbiased and kind of neutral perspective based on external evidence and evidence from his book and his text and his interviews and really everything. So what I really want to say is, if you guys disagree with one of my points, just listen until the end. Just hear me out, hear all my evidence, hear the things I'm putting forward, and then if you disagree with what I'm saying, which is completely natural and is probably going to happen, then feel free to dislike and leave a comment and stuff like that. But all I'm asking is for you guys to stay until the end. That's really the whole point of this introduction, is to go, Haruki Murakami is one of my favorite authors. I'm not setting out to cancel him. I'm setting out really just to analyze who he is as a person and analyze his works and what we can gather from them in terms of his treatment of female characters. Again, he's one of my favorite authors. I love this guy. I love his works. He's a fascinating individual to me. I do think there's some stuff to talk about here, though, which we'll get to when we start getting more in depth with the content in the interviews that I found here today. Also, the final thing I want to clarify is the fact that I am recording this over the course of either the entire day or over a few days, because this is such a serious topic and such an in-depth and well-researched topic that I want to do this video the most amount of justice that I can. And lastly, if you guys checked out my last video, I am doing a Q&A comment show kind of thing. So if you have any questions about books, movies, me, put them in the comment section down below. I'm going to make a video about it. So if you want your question answered, you want to interact with me in some capacity, put a comment down there. And I think that covers everything about my introduction. And I think that's really everything I want to talk about. So without further ado, let's go to part one. So why did I want to make this video? Why now? Well, if you remember my very first video where the framing of the shot was kinda all the way back here and it was really awkward and the framing was weird, the lighting was weird, and the background was weird, and nothing really made a lot of sense. And if you remember that video, I talk a lot about the fact that I think everyone should read Haruki Murakami in some capacity. I think he's that interesting of an author, and I think he's a very interesting gateway into kind of non-American literature and reading foreign authors for anyone who's a new reader in really any single capacity. I think he's someone you should definitely check out. And if you remember where I piled all of the books that I own of his on a stack, I own all of his books, or at least the majority of his books, except for his newest one, First Person Singular. I love this author, and I love him so much, but I've recently got a few comments in some of my videos talking about the fact that people think he's a sexist author, which made me kind of want to dive into more of these criticisms. And when I was going through and rereading Norwegian Wood for a video that Matt and I were going to do, as well as Color Suku Tazaki in his Years of Pilgrimage, as well as what I talk about when I talk about running memoir collection, I did start to notice some potential validity in these criticisms, and some things started to really stand out. So I went back through a lot of his old books, and I started combing through some stuff that I remember being a little weirded out by, even back then when I started reading his books really in high school. So we're talking 6 or 7 years ago now. And more dominoes start to fall, where I then did some research about him and looked up more criticisms on Reddit and Goodreads and found a lot of people did not like his treatment of women. And I must say that there is enough here where I really want to talk about it and make a video about it, because it's my third most popular video. I recommend that people should go check him out. And with that, feels like kind of like a responsibility to kind of, hey, we're new readers. And if you are someone who is interested in checking out his books that you should know that there is some treatment of women characters in there that are really kind of problematic at times. But that's kind of getting to the meat of the content I don't want to jump on yet. But really, I want to talk about this because I got people commenting on it. Like I said before, I want this to be kind of a discussion between us, and really we can talk about really anything. And my favorite author is not above criticism. I also found that rereading a lot of his books and his short stories and going through stuff that I remember was far more interesting than I remember. And I definitely think there's stuff to discuss there and things that we have to talk about because he's arguably the most famous Japanese author of all time. It actually might not even be close. I don't really recall anyone who is as mega worldwide popular as he is. And I think that's something worth talking about. But I also want to clarify, when I provide text evidence, when I provide interviews, I will not be providing stuff from every single one of his books. I have 3 books that I want to talk about primarily, and I have 3 interviews that I want to talk about primarily. So if you're wondering about specifics for each individual book, I have 3. If you have examples from other pieces of text or other interviews that you want to point out, leave them in the comment section down below. I'd love to check them out. I could always make a part 2 to this if people want it. I'm really open to anything, but I found 3 books and 3 interviews that I think could give a lot of insight into who he is as an individual and his treatment of women characters, and addressing a lot of the criticisms that you see about him as an author. When I was doing research about this topic and was wondering if other people had similar opinions to mine, and people did, and people were posing these ideas on Reddit and Goodreads, the most common rebuttal to this argument was the idea of, well, separating art from the artist. Can you separate art from the artist? What does that mean? What can you do there? And I think that's a very, very big rabbit hole to go down, but I really just want to touch on a few key elements of that to kind of save myself from that rebuttal when it happens. The first is, yes, absolutely, you can separate art from the artist. It wouldn't make any sense if art wasn't able to separate from the artist, because you have artists creating these horrific, despicable characters, and that just doesn't make any sense. There is no way that by creating these horrible and despicable characters, that doesn't mean that the artist themselves is a horrible, despicable character. Doesn't mean that if an author, a director, a writer, a painter, really anything, creates a racist, homophobic, classist, sexist, ableist, transphobic character, that doesn't mean the author is necessarily transphobic, racist, really, etc. It doesn't mean that they are. However, if you look at any creators who makes anything and then gives an interview, they always talk about putting a piece of themselves within the media. A few major examples of this, and these are the extreme, is someone like Woody Allen and his film Manhattan, where in Manhattan, he's a 40-year-old character who dates a 17-year-old, which maybe reflects or is a little ironic considering Woody Allen as a figure who we know him now. Or when someone like Louis C.K., the comedian, makes a joke like this, and then we find out all this horrific stuff about him, maybe there's some piece of him he's putting into the comedy. You could even look at the fact that Roman Polanski in his movie Chinatown maybe reflects what he was going through with the murder of Sharon Tate. Or at the end of Chinatown, and spoilers for the movie Chinatown if you haven't seen it, the bad guys win. And there's a lot of reflections of maybe what Roman Polanski was dealing with in terms of his real life, but there's also some weird allusions to rape and incest and a lot of weird stuff that Roman Polanski was charged with later in his life. However, that doesn't mean that this is the case for everyone. I do think there is some truth, and this is my own personal opinion, that when you create something, you put a little piece of yourself in your creation. I think that's true. And when we get more in depth with Haruki Murakami's interviews, you find out later on that his male characters are often very representative of who he is as a person. We'll get more in depth with that with interviews and specific examples, but Haruki Murakami is on record by talking about the fact that he often puts a parallel version of himself in his male characters. And if you learn about him, and if you read his book, What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, you really get a sense that his male characters are him, and the ways male characters see the world are him. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all the elements of the male characters are reflections of Haruki Murakami as a whole, but there is some little piece of truth in there. So can you separate art from the artist? Maybe. In some cases, yes, absolutely. In some cases, no, it might not be. You have to just look at the examples I provided with Woody Allen, Louis C.K., Roman Polanski. And again, those are the extreme examples, but that is a common rebuttal. Just because an author, writer, director puts someone in who's racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, or classist, or really anything, it does not mean that they are. And I know that what I'm saying sounds like it's a case-by-case basis, and it is. Unfortunately, that's how we have to look at it. And since Haruki Murakami is kind of a known recluse and doesn't often give interviews, doesn't often really do anything with the public, it's really hard to piece together who he is. We can really only go through circumstantial evidence and stuff that he said in interviews, which we'll be talking about in detail. This argument of can you separate separate art from an artist was by far the most common rebuttal I saw when people were asking or putting up ideas that he could be a sexist author. And I really just wanted to address it before I get comments about it. I understand that it might not be the case for him, but it also might be, because it might be the case for other people as well. We don't know. I just want to address it beforehand. So everything we talked about so far is entirely circumstantial. We could speculate as much as we want about whether or not he's a sexist author or not, but really what we need to do is look at the text and interviews provided to us to really kind of come to our own conclusions based on the evidence provided. I mentioned in part 2 that I had 3 books that I want to talk about. I really didn't want to touch on every single one of his books because there is evidence provided in a lot of his books, but these are the 3 main ones that I found, and also the 3 ones that I've engaged in recently that really kind of prompted this discussion. The first one is Norwegian Wood, the second one is Kolorosuke Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage, and the third one is What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. Before we really dive into specific text evidence, I first want to focus on how Haruki Murakami emphasizes male characters versus female characters. Like I said earlier, Haruki Murakami puts a part of himself in his male characters. That's something he's admitted in interviews, and that's something we'll look at in a little bit. But his male characters are often extremely internal. They are the ones who are attempting to enter some kind of journey through another world, through another platform, really through anything. But they are the ones who are internal. They're often stagnant and wait for the narrative of the story to come to them rather than take the initiative and take the step forward. Oftentimes, the male characters are only prompted by other side characters to really complete the narrative or the goal or their desire. In a few novels, there's a couple times they actually actively are trying to seek out someone, but that still comes with being prompted by someone else. The male characters in his stories often are languid and not necessarily lazy, but content with their life and minimalist attitude in terms of their approaches to money, food, behaviors, really everything. They are kind of very ordinary characters, and that's entirely the point. Murakami does not focus on interesting characters in the typical sense, but rather how the characters interact with the ever-changing and ever-growing world around them. His characters often are meant to represent some type of theme or go on some type of journey, and really they're a reflection of himself and his ideas and his likes and his dislikes. Haruki Murakami is his male characters in the story. I think that's kind of concrete, and I think we can really make an argument for there that the way in which he writes his male characters is who he is. However, oftentimes his male characters make observations about women, whether that's sexist or kind of physical observations that don't necessarily mean they are Haruki Murakami itself. Haruki Murakami is pretty open about what he likes and dislikes in terms of music, in terms of movies, in terms of culture as a whole, and his characters often reflect that. But I'm fully aware that when he writes his male characters, he's writing it from a male gaze perspective, so we are going to get that kind of luring look at other female characters that does not inherently make Haruki Murakami a sexist author, but that is an observation you should know going into it. His books are written through the male gaze. That's really an unequivocal fact. He is a writer who is writing from the male perspective. On the contrary, his female characters are often the ones with the most amount of personality and development and backstory and really creativity as a whole. His characters often act as kind of a spark plug for our male figures. They are often the ones who are the objects of desire or the objects of kind of a goal or something in mind. If you think of A Wind Up Bird Chronicle, the entire story is about our male character searching for his wife. Murakami often has his female characters disappearing, and then the male characters have to seek them out, and through that seeking out, the male characters often grow or adapt or enter a new world. It's often kind of spiritual or magical realism reflections, but oftentimes his female characters are the ones who are the objects of desire or the objective for the male characters to kind of develop and seek. Because Murakami is writing through the male gaze, his female characters are often sexualized, talk about sex, talk about really anything in that realm a lot. Because we're in the male perspective, the male characters often observe things about women. I will kind of refrain from specifics because I don't want this video to get kind of like age-gated or anything, and I also don't want to create content that might specifically harm or be detrimental to anyone watching, so I'm going to kind of avoid specifics, but he does have a tendency to sexualize younger female characters or place them in sexual situations, have the male characters talk sexual things about them or with them. It's odd, admittedly, from an American's perspective. We kind of view this as kind of a little taboo. I am not 100% familiar with Japanese culture in any capacity, so I can't say if that's a different cultural thing. I think there's a lot of arguments that can be made for him being a a Japanese author and that impact on female characters, but I don't know much about it, so I don't want to speak out of turn, give you guys any false information, really anything like that. In short, his male characters are internal, his female characters are external. His male characters need a female character to kind of drive the narrative forward. Male characters are often content with their life and lack kind of personality and are often kind of languid and ordinary, and his female characters often contain a lot of personality and a lot of life and are the ones who ultimately at the end of the story often end with the most autonomy and the most separation from the constraints of the physical world and society's oppressions against women, or just society as a whole. There's definitely an argument there that his treatment at the end for female characters is actually respectful because he kind of pushes them forward. So I mentioned that we're going to go into specifics with these books, and I don't want to spoil Norwegian Wood, but I do have to talk about specific elements of the book, so just be warned. If you don't want to know anything about it, then click off now, go read Norwegian Wood and come back. But if you don't care, we're going to talk about this now. Specifically, though, we do have to talk about the incident that occurs around page 200 to 205 of this edition that I have here. And that's basically the backstory of Reiko. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. And if you don't know anything, again, I'm not going to spoil anything, but Reiko is a woman in her late 30s, early 40s, who is in this kind of mental sanctuary with our main female character, and our main male character goes to visit them, and that's when our main male character, Toru Watanabe, is given the backstory of Reiko. And there is a lot of speculation of is Reiko telling the truth, but there's undoubtedly a element here that we really need to address, and it's Murakami's treatment of a 13-year-old girl character in Reiko's backstory. So just a little bit of backstory. Reiko is a piano teacher and teaching this 13-year-old girl, and she describes this girl as kind of manipulative and sadistic and vindictive and a lot of different things. But ultimately, this 13-year-old girl kind of takes advantage of this adult character. It's specifically the ages are 13 and 31, and that's something that we really need to address because then it goes into a very detailed sexual situation, and the girl is 13. And I understand that there are cultural differences between America and Japan, but I think we can kind of universally agree as a human species that sexualizing a 13-year-old girl is not good at any capacity. The descriptions of it are kind of graphic, and they're not really fun to read, especially on a third time through. It bothered me the first time I read it, it bothered me the second time I read it, and it's bothered me the third time I read it. I understand that there is going to be an argument that this works thematically for the character of Reiko, who is probably vying after some of the youth, and there's a definite sense of like youth lost, and I understand that there is an approach to it, but I also think that you can make the case that if you make this 13-year-old girl 18, then you kind of take away a lot of that gray area of sexualizing a child, a minor, and I think that's something that is a common trend in a lot of Murakami's writings. Many people are going to look at the story of 1Q84, which has characters having sex with, I think, young girls, maybe even children, if I remember correctly. I read that book once a couple years ago, but I'm going to excuse that one because that's kind of the point of it. It's a cult. It's really supposed to be messed up. The darker elements are not supposed to be something easy to read, but in a very realist story, of a story set in the real world without these kind of darker implications, I don't really think there's an excuse for sexualizing a 13-year-old girl. I want to try to find a justification for it, but I haven't been able to, and it's really, really uncomfortable, admittedly, reading it. And I'm not someone who's very squeamish about this kind of stuff, but I think there's something that we should really talk about there, and I don't think it's very good. However, this does not mean he's a sexist author, so let's keep going. Let's look at another one of his works. Color of Sukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I've reread it 3 times now, and it's incredible. It's kind of going down on me a little bit, but that's a story for another time. But really, I just wanted to focus on one section, and that is the character of Sukuru Tazaki talking about his old friends, Shiro and Kuro. Again, I'm not going to read specifics, but they are placed into a sexual situation when the characters are 16 and 17. The quote is even, they were 16 and 17, invariably that age. And I understand that the events of this is that it's a dream sequence, and it's talking about repressed sexuality and repressed sex and the sexual desire of this male character and the way in which he represses his sexual urges for these characters. But again, these characters are minors. Again, I know I'm looking at this through an American perspective, but these characters are minors. I really don't think there's a way around it. It's a really, really difficult topic to approach, but if you age these characters up a few years, I think everything gets better. And I understand in the context of the story, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but you're looking at this and you're reading this and it makes you uncomfortable. It admittedly does. His treatment of female characters in sexual situations and his proclivity for making these characters younger in age is something we have to take a step back and look at and maybe question and talk about in some capacity. However, just because Haruki Murakami includes this kind of elements, there is slight justification for it, and therefore it doesn't necessarily make him sexist. It doesn't necessarily make him a sexist author. we definitely have to cause suspicion and talk about these elements and these treatments of female characters, but this doesn't make him sexist at all. What really prompted this video was that I read his memoir collection, what I talk about when I talk about running, and specifically one section that I'm going to get to in just a second. But this is a non-fiction story. There is no fiction in this. This is not Murakami writing through the perspective of another male character. This is Murakami writing himself. This is him making observations about the world, observations about himself, mainly observations about running and his approach to it and his relationships with running. But there is an aspect in here that I want to talk about, and this is what entirely prompted the video, and it's this. Murakami lived in Cambridge for a certain amount of time, and as someone who lives in Massachusetts myself, I knew all the areas he's talking about. And this is when he's describing the Boston area during summer. And there's a part in here where he's talking about kind of the rich who go to the Cape to escape the heat, or kind of the area itself, or it's kind of where all the Harvard and Boston students go. There's one element though, that's this. Young girls in revealing bikinis are sunbathing on beach towels, listening to their Walkman or iPods. It seems pretty innocent and unassuming right off the start. It's just Murakami making observations about the people he sees around them, but in the grand, larger scope of this book, it makes absolutely no sense why this is included. There is no added benefit to including a detail like this, especially when it's really completely out of left field. He's describing the environment, and then he kind of talks about girls in revealing bikinis. I don't have a justification for this. This isn't a story. This isn't separating art from an artist. This is the artist. This is what he sees. This is what he talks about. This is how he views the world. He sees girls sunbathing and feels the need to point out the fact that they're in revealing bikinis, and it's really, really questionable. I think this is the first time we can really start looking at this and going, maybe there's some validity to these arguments, and maybe we should really start talking about him potentially being a sexist author, and his treatment of female characters being questionable as a whole. This is where I may have lost some of you guys. It's one sentence in a 150-page book, and it doesn't occur again, but I think it's something where when you're looking at the author and you're trying to find someone's voice and who they are, when they're so recluse and they don't often give a lot of interviews or anything like that, and you finally get an insight into their mind, and it's this, and you get this observation about what he sees, it starts to add a lot of validity to these comments and these criticisms, and it starts to kind of tie pieces together to his treatment of women. It's why he often talks about the breast sizes of women, or feels the need for his male characters to make kind of sexual comments about them, or sexual observations. Murakami has talked about his male characters being a reflection of himself, a parallel, rather. And this is Murakami himself. He feels the need to point this out, and I think this is kind of a really good framework to build this argument off of. I understand you can separate art from the artist, but this is not that. This is Murakami himself. I could go through every single one of his books and probably find one thing like that. I could really go through Dance 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 and talk about the relationship between our main character and our younger female character. I could talk about the treatment of the characters in 1284. I could talk about the stuff in Hardboiled Wonderland. I could talk about the stuff in After Dark. I could talk about the stuff in Wind Up Bird Chronicle. I could talk about a lot of stuff here, but really, I just want to focus on these three elements because I think these three books provide a really interesting insight into who he is as a person, who he is as a writer. His memoir collection is the biggest insight we have into who he is as a person outside of his interviews. It's the closest thing we have to direct confirmation about how he sees the world. And I think that's really something we should take a step back and look at and maybe re-examine who he is as an author and who he is as a person. So we could sit here and analyze his books as much as we want, or we could sit here and analyze his memoir collection and really look for key details because that's the direct insight we have to his voice, or we can just look at direct interviews that we have from him. Murakami is not known for giving interviews. I have found 3. One's with The New Yorker, one's with Inside Hook, and one is when he sat down with another up-and-coming Japanese author who really looks up to Murakami and who interviewed him about his treatment of female characters. So this is when I will be providing direct evidence and reading directly from his quotes and talking about it and talking about my understanding of it and really working to pinpoint who he is as a person through these interviews. This first interview that I'm looking at is through Inside Hook, and this is when the interviewer asked him the question. I asked because when the novelist Miko Kawakami interviewed you, she pressed you on the topic saying, there's a persistent tendency for women to be sacrificed for the sake of the male leads. So the question is, why is it that women are so often called upon to play this role in Murakami novels? The new stories seem to really respond. What do you think about her observations? Murakami then responds saying, if the revolution happened next month, I might be arrested for the crime of thinking erroneous thoughts, have a 3-cornered red hat stuck on my head, be cursed by the mob, and strung up from the nearest lamppost. But that's just the way it goes. I've enjoyed the way I live my life. I've never followed the tide of popular opinion in the way I write my novels. I'm not going to start now. So what do we have here? Well, we have a man who seems to be very stringent in the way he writes. He seems to almost be placing himself as the victim here and kind of being like, well, man, listen, I just write. I mean, if I get arrested and killed for my thoughts, then oh, so be it. But I'm not going to change. This is who I am. He doesn't really address the criticism. He actually kind of just brushes it off entirely, at least in this specific response. He kind of just goes, I've never followed the popular trend of readers and books and making my own things and following the criticisms and listening to criticisms. I'm not going to start now. Why would I? And to me, that really feels like he's brushing off a lot of criticisms. There is a actual famous female Japanese author approaching him and going, your treatment of female characters is kind of suspicious. It really feels like your female characters are for the modification of the male characters. And he's like, I don't care. He's like, oh man, I'm sorry for thinking weird thoughts or erroneous thoughts, as he says. Man, string me up, whatever, execute me. And you're like, whoa, what? Like, no, just address these issues. He does address this before where the interviewer asks, are you consciously changing the way you write about women? He's like, I can't really say, I've never really thought about it. And again, that just feels like someone who's just like, I don't hear your criticisms, and I don't hear about the fact that maybe my treatment of female characters is detrimental to my female readers. And I know I'm speculating a lot here, and I know I'm kind of putting words into the reader's mouth, but this really feels like someone who was born in a time when this kind of stuff may have been okay and is not really adapting to modern times, and his novels are getting criticized and he's not really hearing it. Later in this interview, Murakami kind of rejects the idea that there's any kind of conscious pattern to his female characters, and really by saying, this may not be the most satisfying explanation, but I don't think any of my characters are that complex, which is interesting because I would argue that his female characters are purposely complex and far more complex than the male characters, but the criticism is not the complexity of the characters, it's the way in which the male characters view the female characters in the story. And again, that does not mean that he's sexist, but it also means that if this is through his gaze, this is what he's seeing, this is what he's talking about. And if he's someone who's like, hey, your male characters objectify women in some capacity, then him just kind of burying his hand in the sand and going, oh man, I'm not really any of these things. I'm like, whatever, I'm just, execute me. If the revolution started, I'd be strung up. Just feels like someone who is ignoring all these criticisms. But that's just one interview. Let's look at another one. The next interview we're going to look at is one done by the New Yorker, and this one doesn't directly talk about his female characters, but this one's kind of the evidence for how he approaches his male characters. The interview asked the question, writing, like running, is a solitary pursuit. You went from a very social life in a jazz club, where there are people around you all the time, to being alone in your study. Which is more comfortable for you? I don't do socialization much, he says. I like to be by myself in a quiet place with a lot of records and possibly cats, and cable TV to watch the baseball game. I think that's all I want. Although it's not directly addressing his treatment of male characters, this is who his male characters are. His male characters are solitary, they want to do things themselves, they often sit in introspection by themselves with minimal things, with minimal kind of records, with really everything. Murakami is his male characters. I think we can look at that and kind of definitively say for a fact, oh yeah, that's right, Murakami places himself in there. Therefore, that adds to validity for the criticisms that we're facing of the male gaze. Another question addressed is the interviewer asked, you sent a Paris interview a few years ago that said that the driving force of your stories was missing and searching and finding. Do you still think that's true? Murakami then answers, yes, that is a very big theme of my fiction, missing something and seeking it and finding it. My characters are often looking for something that has been lost. Sometimes it's a girl, sometimes it's a cause, sometimes it's a purpose, but they are looking for something important, something critical that was lost. But when the character finds it, there'll still be some kind of disappointment. I don't know why, but that's the kind of motif in my fiction, looking for something and finding it, but it's not a happy ending. We also right there add some proof that the male characters are often searching for something that at times a female character is often the object of a desire, of a purpose, of a find in some capacity, through journey, through really anything. The female character is often placed as a desire, as an object, and not necessarily its own defined character. And I think for me, a lot of the criticisms that I find with his books are very valid. And I think the biggest focus we should be focusing on is not his male gaze treatment of female characters, but rather the younger age of the characters. The 13, the 15, the 16, 17, characters that are definitively, from an American perspective and American ideals and American culture, minors and characters that cannot and should not be sexualized. It is not the point of the story. It is not serving some larger focus, and it doesn't really seem to be serving a larger theme. All you have to do is look at the Norwegian Wood section, where the character's 13 and kind of the predator of this 31-year-old character, and it really starts to twist your understanding of who he is. If you just make that character older, maybe a legal adult, 18, 19, I think you can still keep a lot of the themes and motifs he's going for, while still not sexualizing a minor. I think a lot of the criticisms here about his treatment of female characters do have slight justifications, but the sexualization of his younger characters, I think, is a no-go. I'm just my own personal opinion. I really struggle with it, and I can't find any justification for it. The last interview, and I'm not going to talk about specifics here, but just the interview as a whole, is called A Feminist Critique of Murakami Novels with Murakami himself. It's when Miko Kawakami interviews Murakami and talks kind of about his treatment of female characters and really everything like that. I'm going to put the link to all these interviews and stuff in the description down below so you can check them out on your own, but I'm not the biggest fan of this interview. I think it provides some interesting insight. Their line that comes up is, Murakami says, "That's right, he," referring to the main character of Killing Commendador, "the sort of person who a 12-year-old girl will feel comfortable talking to about her breast. He is that kind of personality." You know, there's context for that, but I think if you're looking at the story of Killing Commendador, that might not be your cup of tea. I think the interviewer starts to show a little too much adulation to Murakami at times. He doesn't really get to the heart of any of these criticisms, but there is some interesting insight into who he is as a person and who he is really in his treatment of female characters, and really get the sense that he just doesn't care, or just doesn't seem to really be aware of it, maybe. He often seems to kind of struggle with answering these questions. He doesn't even really seem to understand the questions that Miko Kawakami is asking, or where she's even coming from. Or his answer is like, "I just don't write any complex characters. I often talk about the relationship with the world, but I don't really focus on individual characteristics," which is just not true, because his female characters have unique and specific characteristics that are in direct contrast to the male character. That's just true. You read any of his books, and that's absolutely the case. I really don't understand what he's talking about here. So we looked at text, we looked at evidence, we looked at really his interviews, his fictions, his memoirs. We really looked at everything that he provided here. And what do I think? I don't have an answer, and that might seem a little bit like a cop-out, but I think this is far too complex of a question to really tackle in this one specific video. If you think he's a sexist author, I completely understand. I'm not trying to fight you on that. If you don't think he is, and you think we can just separate art from artist, maybe go take a look at his interviews. Maybe take a look at the way he brushes aside these kind of criticisms. I also really can't fight these criticisms. If you think he's a sexist author, he probably is to your perspective, and I can't disagree with that. But again, I don't have an answer, and that might be a cop-out after probably a 25-30-minute video, but I really wanted to present all this evidence to you guys and just talk about it. Talk about it in the comment section down below. Dislike the video. Do whatever you want with this video. I really just want to say, this is my favorite author. I have recommended his books before, but he's not immune to criticism. Here's all the evidence I've provided. Now let's talk about it. Let's be a community of people who like his stuff, but also can criticize his stuff, because no person, no author, no one is perfect, and no one should be immune to criticism, especially when he has content like this in his books. I think we really have to examine the purpose of it, and is it important and necessary to his books? And with that, I'd probably say no. I don't think his sexualization of younger, minor female characters is necessary to the long-standing treatment of his books. It would probably take some restructuring to actually make the characters legally old enough to talk about that. But I think there's just some areas like Norwegian Wood which we can't forgive and we can't forget. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave this video? Well, this is for you guys to decide. If you don't like what I'm saying, you didn't like my argument, that's completely okay. I really just want to make this video for myself and get all this evidence out there and really put this forward to you guys. If you agree with me, awesome. I'm really glad we can kind of open this discussion. If you don't, if you do, talk about it in the comment section down below. Do what you want to do. I am here to kind of engage with you guys. This is supposed to be an open platform where all opinions and perspectives are encouraged. I want to encourage this kind of stuff. I want you guys to discuss this and really do what you want with this video. This is now in your hands. I can always come back and make a part 2, responding to some of your comments, stuff like that, and we can really go from there. But right now, I think I did the best that I could presenting evidence, and we just really see where the dice roll, see what you guys think. So that takes us to the end of this video. If you guys liked it, you know what to do with it. If you guys didn't, you know what to do with it as well. If you haven't already, check out Matt and Mark's channel. They make excellent content. If you haven't already, our movie podcast is back. Check it out on YouTube, on Spotify, iTunes, all that kind of podcast stuff. And if you like this video or what kind of videos you want to see or what kind of videos you want me to talk about, leave a comment down below. I'll take a look at them. I'm always down for recommendations, not just to make videos on, but just stuff to read and watch. So that again will take us to the end of the video. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you again soon.